So you may recall in late 2017 I talked about a report from the Institute of Public Affairs on the rise of identity politics in history classes taught at Australian universities. The report was authored by Dr. Bella de Brera, the Director of the Foundations of Western Civilization at the IPA. Here's a much younger me from 2017. So Dr. de Brera reviewed each of the 746 history subjects at the 35 Australian universities that offered a history program in 2017. And she did that by examining publicly available course descriptions for those subjects and university handbooks. She then categorised each of the 746 subjects into one of 5 categories according to what was regarded as the primary focus or theme of the subject. They being Australian history, other histories, theory and practical, identity politics, and the essential core topics of the history of Western civilization. Now, do you want to have a guess as to which category had the most subjects? That's right, identity politics, with 244, or almost a third of all subjects. And if you think that almost a third of all history courses taught at Australian universities with a primary focus on identity politics sounds absurdly high, well, it's probably even worse than that.
Having looked at these subjects, I was being generous when I categorised the 244 subjects as identity politics, because they were the blatant ones. But when you go and you read the course descriptions and the subject titles, there's always a word slipped in there, there's always gender, there's always race, there's always this idea of identity, but it's so common, even in ancient history.
Anyway, this month the good doctor has released another report, this time an audit on Australian history subjects taught at Australian universities, of which there were 147 subjects in 2018 at the 35 universities that offered such courses. The methodology was essentially the same as the 2017 report. The subject descriptions were analysed by themes for keywords in both the name of the subject and or the course description. So let's have a look at the results. The most common theme in the 147 subjects offered is identity politics, identified in 102 subjects, followed by Indigenous history and studies, 57 subjects, and war and conflict, 53 subjects. Drilling down, we can see that of the 102 identity politics subjects, 15 are about class, 37 race, and 50 gender. Contrast that with 4 on democracy, 3 on enlightenment, and 1 on capitalism. Another finding of the report is the almost complete erasure of the individual, with a total of just 3 mentioned in the 147 Australian history subjects taught in 2018. Charles Wentworth and Henry Lawson are mentioned in 1 subject, Pauline Hanson is mentioned in 3 different subjects, and no Australian Prime Minister is mentioned in any subject. And I imagine that Pauline Hanson isn't mentioned in a positive light in any of those subjects. She's most likely used as a piñata for social justice activism. Later on, de Brera notes that there is 1 subject at the University of Adelaide that examines the legacy of the Menzies and Whitlam governments, and at the University of South Australia that touches on the end of the Menzies era, the Hawke and Keating governments, and the Howard era. De Brera notes, there is no discussion of the individual contribution of these former Prime Ministers during their years in office. History as a discipline is being taught as a political and social commentary on current affairs rather than as a study of the nation's past. Certainly, there is little or no mention of the individual contributions which have been made by men and women to the development of Australia as a nation. Also noteworthy was the complete absence of the liberal foundations of Australia's democracy, with not a single mention of the word liberal or liberalism. De Brera concludes that students of Australian history are not being taught the basic concepts which explain the origins of Australian society and its successes as a modern nation. Well, of course not. The aim of history is not to educate, it's to produce activists. Now let's have a look at some examples of the type of course descriptions labelled as identity politics. Sexuality in Australia at the Australian National University. How have the sex lives of Australians changed since the arrival of the first European settlers in the 18th century? And what can a study of the history of sexuality tell us about the dynamics of Australian history? Probably nothing useful. This course will offer key themes in the history of sexuality in Australia since 1788, with an emphasis on ideas, attitudes, practices and identities. The evolving relationship between Australian and international developments will be a central theme. Topics to be studied will include convicts and sexuality, sexual relations on the frontier, prostitution, sexual violence, the women's movement, sex reform and sexology, the regulation of sexuality by the state, homosexuality, and the transformation of sexual cultures, ideas, and practices. The course will also examine how an understanding of sexual diversity in the past can illuminate current debates in Australian society. Could you imagine actually paying money to study that? Or if that's not your cup of tea, how about race and place at the University of Wollongong? Why does race matter now? In a progressive, multicultural country such as Australia, we highly value equality and therefore believe that racial heritage should not influence people's opportunities. Yet it does. In this subject, students will develop an understanding of the intellectual history of race thinking, how it has shaped and influenced policies, popular culture, and everyday life. We will critically reflect upon how race thinking and racialized practices impact upon and structure major social issues and everyday cultural practices, such as environmentalism, health, law, punishment and justice, sport, art, music, and ideas of home, community, and nation. In other words, you'll learn that minorities are oppressed and it's the fault of evil white people. And to what do we owe these developments in the teaching of Australian history? Well, the good doctor claims it has a lot to do with postmodernism and in particular the scribblings of Foucault. Quote, his underlying ideas, derived from Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger, were that neither truth nor knowledge are grounded in reality but are merely subjective constructs created by one group for the sole purpose of wielding power over another. He proposed that knowledge is power and history is fiction. Accordingly, the sole purpose for writing historical accounts is to retell the past in order that power might be reclaimed and past abuses rectified. Ultimately, the historian's role, therefore, is not that of a redactor, but of social commentator and political activist. Hence the rise of this social justice warrior armed with the ignorance of a bad education. Now, if you want to read more about the state of Australian history, you can check out the 20-page report at the IPA, or alternatively, you can listen to Dr. Abrera talk about it on the Young IPA podcast. Links to both in the comments below. And while you're down there, let me know your thoughts on the state of Australian history teaching at our esteemed universities of social justice. I'll see you next time.